Awesome. That's great. Yeah. So we wish we could all be together in person, but the online thing is good for spreading the word around the world. So we're glad people can join us that way as well. I'm Bill Cavanaugh. I'm director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology here at DePaul. Welcome to the 17th annual World Catholicism Week. We have been doing this now for that many years, bringing scholars together from around the world to talk about one theme, and we have a whole book series called Studies in World Catholicism that we'd encourage you to check out, and a lot of those volumes are the result of these conferences that we've had. And the theme of this year's conference is hope. Pope Francis chose the theme of hope for the Jubilee year for obvious reasons that we need more of it, and hopefully we'll leave the conference today and tomorrow with some more of it. I've talked to my students a lot about the difference between hope and optimism. Optimism, the idea that things aren't so bad, and hope, the idea that, yeah, things are bad, but we're not going to let the darkness overcome the light. We're going to look directly at the darkness and stubbornly refuse to give into it. And I think that's defines our late Pope Francis. He lived under a brutal military dictatorship in Argentina, and he saw what the worst of that humanity was capable of. And he was fearless in denouncing the political and economic idolatries of the world. But at the same time, he was relentless in hope and love. His trust that God was stronger than evil, that love was stronger than hate. And he was relentless in calling the followers of Christ to follow Christ both through the cross and the resurrection. So we're gathering these 2 days in the spirit of Pope Francis, and we'll hear from a tremendous variety of speakers from around the world. We'll illustrate and probe theologies and politics and church practices of hope. So to get us started, I want to hand over the microphone to Beth Jennings-White, the executive director of the Taller de José here in Chicago, and she will introduce our keynote speaker.
Hi, good afternoon to everyone present in the room and on Facebook Live. Hello. I am the executive director of Taller de José. We're a small not-for-profit here in we're Engaged Park community of Chicago, and we were founded by the Sisters of St. Joseph, and now the Archbishop, he was then a pastor, Archbishop Casey, who's the Archbishop of Cincinnati, to help bridge the immigrant community to legal, healthcare, all the social service, immigration, all the kinds of things that were available to them that they did not have access to because of language and other things like that. So our ministry is a ministry of accompaniment, where we literally go with our clients to various locations and help them access the services that they so deserve. So it is my pleasure to be here. So I will be after our keynote presentation on Eschatology at the Border by Dylan Corbett, we're going to be open for Q&A at the end. We should probably have about 30 minutes. I will monitor that for us, and we will also be able to ask questions on Facebook. So we will have someone back there shooting those questions out for us. So let's settle in, and let me just introduce Dylan. So Dylan comes to us from El Paso, Texas, where he has a wife and 2 children, and they've graciously lent him to us today. He is the founder and executive director of Hope Border Institute, and that is a faith-based research, advocacy, and humanitarian action organization at the U.S.-Mexico border. For over 15 years, he has experience working in international and human development globally in Washington, D.C., and in the borderlands. Dylan has served as an official at the Vatican's Dicastery for promoting integral human development and also coordinated the work of the Vatican's Migrants and Refugees section in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. He has extensive experience working with the USCCB, other Vatican agencies, and we're just really pleased to have him here with us in Chicago. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And good afternoon, everybody. It's a real treat to be with you all. Let me just repeat that. It's an honor to be here for this conference and also for World Catholicism Week. I'm a fan of many of you in this room, a friend of some, and some of you are my real intellectual and theological heroes, including Dr. Kavanaugh. So it's such a delight to be with you and to learn from you during these days. I do feel somewhat inadequate to the task of offering this keynote. I've studied some theology, but I'm certainly no theologian and no academic. As they'll know at Taller de San Jose, the reality of nonprofit life is overwhelming. And once it takes hold of your life, budgets and spreadsheets and fundraising displace all the time that you have available for theological reflection. In addition to making sure endlessly that all the facility doors are closed, just in case the Texas Attorney General tries to show up and knock on the door and give you a summons. There are some who talk about, and I think this is true of Chicago too, Catholic mafia in El Paso, Texas. I can assure you there are really not that many of us, and it's not often that we get invited to see the world outside of El Paso, so we might lack the refinement and manners that you might expect. So as I start this presentation this afternoon, buyer beware, although many thanks to the organizing committee. I want to also start by acknowledging that in the church right now, of course, we're still in this period of mourning following the death of our Holy Father, Pope Francis. Francis was my hero, and for several years he was also my boss because he was he had named himself the director of the Vatican section on migrants and refugees. So I felt his loss very personally these days. We pray for him today. And I ask for his intercession this afternoon. What I'd like to do this afternoon is comment on the current political situation that we face in the United States, especially as it relates to immigration and immigration at the border, and also speak to the role of faith in providing direction in this context and sustaining hope for the Catholic community as we navigate this reality. First, though, let me talk a little bit about where I come from, El Paso. I arrived here at the conference yesterday from El Paso, so let me just share a few words about that community to provide some context about my own vantage point. There are a lot of preconceptions about El Paso, that it's a small and dusty outpost, that it's replete with saloons and cowboys and bandits and scorpions, that it's in the middle of nowhere. Now that's true, it is in the middle of nowhere. We're about 4 hours away in any direction from the closest neighboring city. And it's also true that it's very dusty. Ask my wife, who will never let me open the windows ever in any season at any time of the day. And there are scorpions, and we do have saloons. Despite what they'll tell you in Tijuana and San Diego, the margarita was invented in Paso del Norte. And we do have cowboys. Despite what they'll tell you in Fort Worth, we sell more cowboy boots per capita than any other city in the United States. But we're not small. We're a community of about 750,000 people. The largest border metroplex in the Western Hemisphere. And just across from us, on the other side of the border in Mexico, just a few minutes from where I live, is Ciudad Juárez in Mexico. And that's a community of about 1.5 million people. So it's quite large. We're sister cities. We share the same water under the ground. Every day, thousands of students, professors, workers, family members, priests, nuns, They crossed the border and in both directions, north and south. Pancho Villa, the famed Mexican revolutionary, lived in downtown El Paso and trained his troops actually in El Paso. We share food, we share language, we share faith, and because we're both in the desert, in the middle of nowhere, we depend on one another. Together, our two communities, originally one before the coming of the Republic of Texas and then the United States, which prized apart and divided us at the banks of the Rio Grande. We've negotiated 3 wars: the Mexican War of Independence, the Texas Revolution, and the Mexican-American War, and 6 social political orders: the indigenous, the Spanish, the Mexican, the Texan, the American, and the post-NAFTA global world order. And the most important conflict of them all, Texas versus Mexican food. Spoiler alert, Mexican food wins. Today we're one city, divided by historical accident, conflicting imperial imperatives, economic inequality, and a border wall. In no small part because we've had to navigate together all of these twists and turns of history, there's developed among our binational community a deep sensitivity to the displaced, a sensitivity nourished by our spiritual traditions, especially the indigenous traditions, the crypto-Sephardic Judaism of the colonial diaspora, the Christianity and Catholicism in particular, which arrived with the colonization, and the Jewish and Protestant faiths, which arrived in the 19th century. This sensitivity, alloyed with the strength and deep motivations of faith, has produced a remarkable culture of hospitality in the borderlands. That hospitality unique to our border community has accompanied waves of human displacement over our history. The movement of the indigenous due to climate change and conflict, the arrival of the Spanish, the arrival of the Texans and then the Americans, the Chinese and the Irish who built the railroad connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, the African-American buffalo soldiers, Juarenses and Cristeros fleeing the early 20th century Mexican Revolution, Braceros who worked in the factories and the fields east and west of the city during World War II, Guatemalans, Hondurans, Nicaraguans, and Salvadorans fleeing US-backed covert wars in Latin America in the 80s, Mexicans uprooted by NAFTA in the 90s, the more recent arrivals of unaccompanied children and families escaping hunger and crime, violence against women, and a changing climate in northern Central America. Cubans, Venezuelans, Ukrainians, Afghans, and young men fleeing Chiapas right now in a country riven by the drug war. They arrive with dreams, aspirations, and hope to work, to contribute, and ganas de salir adelante. On both sides of the border, over years, decades, and centuries, we've endeavored to provide a humane and dignified welcome through migrant shelters and by providing food, medical care, and transportation. We respond with hospitality because we know, as the Hebrew scriptures teach us, that we were once them. In recent decades, these efforts have taken on greater institutional form. In Mexico, there's a chain of migrant shelters throughout the country, from Tapachula in the south all the way to Ciudad Juarez in the north, and everywhere in between, run by women religious, grassroots Catholic communities, and priests. This network was strengthened and grown significantly as part of a binational effort, the U.S. and Mexico, following the 2003 joint pastoral letter between the bishops of Mexico and the United States, Strangers No Longer. In El Paso, the chains of hospitality continue, led by organizations like Annunciation House, a grassroots Catholic organization, as well as a number of parishes and religiously inspired initiatives. And this is not only true in El Paso, but across the border, from Tijuana to Matamoros, from San Diego to Laredo to McAllen, including Catholic Charities agencies and diocesan initiatives. Hospitality is a way of life at the border. Now let me talk about the Trump administration's actions in the last 100 days. The actions since January 20th have been rapid and far-reaching in scope. On day one, minutes after the president took the oath of office, aspiring asylum seekers and vulnerable migrants with appointments for initial screenings to begin the asylum process. Many who had waited for months in trying conditions in northern Mexican border cities were turned away at the bridge between El Paso and Juarez. Since that moment, on January 20th, asylum, a mechanism of protection for those fleeing persecution and conflict, one that's enshrined both in international law and in federal law, has been absolutely and entirely suspended. In addition to suspending refugee law at the US-Mexico border, the administration has also ceased the processing of international refugees and ceased work with the family of civil society organizations that work to process and welcome refugees, including the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. The administration has also moved to cut contracts with civil society organizations providing critical legal services to immigrants, including children caught up in the immigration system, including unaccompanied minors who have crossed the border. Abroad, the administration has also frozen or suspended several important areas of foreign assistance, including funding intended to mitigate immigration. It's true, the administration's record thus far in deportation doesn't yet match the rhetoric of the campaign to launch the largest mass deportation campaign in human history, in American history. However, there are many troubling indicators that they intend to make good on that threat. First, being here on a campus, in a university campus. As you know, the administration has attempted to cancel student visas and use detention and removal against student visa holders in a chilling attempt to control speech, an action clearly oriented towards sending a message to a broader audience than just visa holders. The administration has also moved to remove legal status from hundreds of thousands of legal parole and TPS holders from Venezuela and many countries in Central America and the Caribbean, including conflict-torn Haiti. This is an action which effectively expands the pool of persons by potentially more than 1 million vulnerable to deportation. Thousands of troops have also been surged to the border following the declaration of a state of emergency on January 20th, including to El Paso, despite record low numbers of arrivals at the border over the past year. The administration has also designated a new military national defense area along the border of New Mexico and Mexico, seizing 170 miles of border between Arizona and Texas. This complements Texas's own military takeover of the border in recent years under a program known as Operation Lone Star, in contravention of federal law and the supremacy clause of the US Constitution, which was largely unchallenged by the Biden administration. The Trump administration has already begun to make arrests of so-called alien trespassers on this new 170-mile military installation. The growing architecture of the state of exception goes beyond just the militarization of the border. It extends, as you know, to the standing up of immigrant detention facilities at Guantanamo and the sending of immigrants accused without due process to a terrorist holding facility in El Salvador. Flights to Guantanamo and El Salvador go through a military base in El Paso. Secretary of State Rubio has indicated that he's actively courting other countries to quote him as far away as possible to replicate the operation. The administration does not currently have the ability to arrest, detain at scale, but they are making headway. An example, they just cut a contract with a private vendor in El Paso for a sum equivalent to ICE's entire 2024 budget. Similar facilities like the one that is now standing up in El Paso for detention are also being contemplated in other parts of the country. The last necessary step in laying down the groundwork for mass deportations will be funding, but that is coming. As we speak, congressional Republicans are finalizing budgets expected to be passed in the next couple months. The current House Judiciary bill that they prepared provides $45 billion for building new immigrant detention centers, including family detention centers. This amount is 13 times ICE's 2024 budget for detention. The bill also funds ICE enforcement and deportation operations by an additional $27 billion, which includes funding for the hiring of an additional 10,000 ICE agents. There's also $51.6 billion for additional border wall construction, which is 3 times what the Trump administration spent during its first term. In our community of about 700,000 people in El Paso, we have more than 50,000 people without documents. In El Paso, 1 in 3 of those people without documents have a U.S. citizen child. As it would be throughout the country, in El Paso, mass deportation would be an economic, social, and moral catastrophe. Now, let me go back for a moment and speak again about the growing state of exception that's happening at the border, which is now bleeding over into a broader attack on civil society, free speech, and academic institutions. We often hear the word crisis paired with language about the border. The border, in our imaginary and our public conscience, is always in crisis and is always a crisis. However, we have an idle definition of what this crisis is and what its constitutive elements are. Clarifying by what we mean by this crisis is an essential step to provide an adequate pastoral response. The crisis is often identified as the high number of encounters at the border, or as the need to use military force to repel migrants and so-called dangerous smugglers, or the lack of funding for detention and surveillance. But the crisis is never defined by the people who remain stranded in Mexican cities because they cannot seek asylum. The crisis is never defined by the people we're turning away to danger, nor is it defined by the record-breaking number of migrant deaths at the U.S.-Mexico border, including El Paso. Nor is it defined by the inhumane conditions in detention centers, or the violence inflicted upon vulnerable families by border agents with no restraint in the use of force. Nor do we consider the racial profiling of our neighbors in this new campaign of mass stops, arrests, and quick family separations. But the border crisis is not a crisis of numbers, a budget, or enforcement. The border crisis is a crisis of a broken immigration system and a deeper crisis of a fractured humanity, where the dignity and the safety of the most vulnerable are crushed in favor of purported national security, economic, or ideological goals. So the border crisis has at least 3 elements. 1, a moral element. We allow people to die. We actively harm vulnerable families, even separating them in raids or at the border, and send them away to danger by denying any access to refuge, hospitality, or accompaniment. Death is part of the overhead of enforcement. 2, a political element. Our policies are not responding to the dignity and the human potential of each person, nor to the needs of our border communities. Instead, they're responding to achieving logistical and ideological goals that have nothing to do with the sacredness of life. When we put logistics, the number of encounters, or ideology, optics of a reduced quote-unquote chaos, over life, we reproduce and justify death. And 3, a prophetic element. For the border, the only prophets of death are permitted. The voices of border communities, of those who migrate, and people of goodwill who are offering alternatives to this cruel system are silenced, neglected, and even threatened, as we've seen with multiple cases in Texas against Catholic hospitality providers. No one is prophesying a system that respects life. This is the nature of the attack on religious liberty in Texas, where the Attorney General has attacked faith-based providers offering hospitality. Religious liberty is often used as a strategy of opting out of society, and many times legitimately. But here, we are opting in radically, prophetically, and that act of prophecy is being actively silenced. Before this unfolding metastasization of the state of exception, the dissolution of democratic practice and norms, and the violation of the rights and dignity of vulnerable persons on the move, what are we called to do as the body of Christ? Let me answer that question in 2 parts, with 2 stories. During the first Trump administration, as we approached the 2018 midterm elections, the Trump administration began leaning quite heavily into fear narratives around approaching caravans of migrants which had passed from Central America into Mexico and onwards to the U.S.-Mexico border. After those midterms in 2018, the new Congress threatened to withhold funding for Trump's immigration enforcement actions at the border. Now remember, this was after a year, the first year of the Trump administration, when we had significant and radical enforcement actions, including family separation. In response, the Trump administration began turning people who were kept in unsanitary and inhumane conditions in mass immigrant detention centers onto the streets in El Paso. This was political theater, intended to generate an image of chaos at the border. They did this on the day before Christmas Eve. They did it for days after that, and as a tactic of political theater, to challenge all those in Congress who were threatening a government shutdown over funding for additional immigration enforcement, which the president wanted. The response in El Paso was generous and was swift. We set up a makeshift triage center in downtown El Paso and got people to hospitality centers. People from the whole community came down to support the effort. They brought soup, they brought caldo, they brought toys, they brought money. I remember one police officer stuffing money into his pocket, but making it clear that it came from his wife, not him. It was a beautiful moment of community solidarity. But in the maelstrom of those December events, two things happened. Just as those releases were happening, 2 children died in El Paso, both from Guatemala, Jacqueline Cal and Felipe Gomez Alonso. Both had been in the custody of Border Patrol in El Paso in those unsanitary conditions, and both had been neglected systematically when they presented urgent health conditions. Reflecting with the local Catholic bishop, we decided to go visit the families in Guatemala with a delegation of clergy. We arrived by helicopter to visit Jacqueline, who lived in a poor, indigenous, and rural village. When we arrived to the mother's house, there was absolutely nothing that we could say. Before her pain, our hands were painfully empty. To get to the house, we had to walk a few kilometers through the jungle before we got to her small village. When we asked her mother what Jacqueline was like, her mother pointed to the path that we had taken through the jungle, and she said that when she left the house, she went away happy and joyful because she was going to make money to build a house for her family. She said that she was going on an adventure with her dad. She and her family were looking for a life of peace. The image of that path, of her traveling down the path hand in hand with her dad, I have burned in my mind. I realized in that moment that it was our system that had killed her and her aspirations. She died a witness to that broken system. After a year of family separation and the painful experience of meeting the families of Jacqueline and Felipe, my heart had burst in that 2018. But for the first time, there was some progress politically. For the first time, the opposition party stood for holding the line on increasing budgets for the militarization of the border and the criminalization of those who migrate. It seemed that there was progress. It had been tangible and painful, but there was progress. Fast forward a couple of years to the 2020 election. Candidate Joe Biden had made a promise during the election to restore humanity to our immigration system. As president, he did take some smart, though at times stumbling steps to provide legal pathways to those fleeing the economic and political crises in Venezuela and in Haiti. He provided pathways for family reunification for some countries in Central America. Despite record detention numbers, his administration began to implement rational enforcement priorities. In the second half of his administration, however, the crackdown at the border began. There was one and then another significant asylum restriction, raising the bar for credible fear for individuals and families fleeing to the border for protection. There were accelerated removals and the denial of due process by blocking access to attorneys for those in those accelerated hearings. There was further collusion with Mexico, the pressuring of that country by the Biden administration to weaponize its National Guard, originally created to address narco violence against migrants, to the point that the patrolling, arrest, and detention of migrants became the exclusive focus of Mexico's National Guard, an institution rife with human rights abuses. Having seen its strategy of dissuasion through force in Mexico successful, the administration exported the model to Panama and began deploying enforcement personnel from the Department of Homeland Security as advisors to the Panamanian authorities, who began to implement a similar model of dissuasion, detention, and removal. All of this coincided, of course, with the 2024 presidential elections. And during the election, it wasn't clear what distinguished candidate Biden from Trump on the issue of arriving asylum seekers. After Biden dropped out, candidate Harris adopted the hardline aesthetics of immigration enforcement at the border in her campaign messaging. Public opinion on migration was swaying, and the commitments of the opposition party were eroding. The public leadership of the progressive movement in the United States was turning their back on those at the border, outflanked and outsmarted by persistent fear-mongering on the political right over years and years. To such a point that this year, in 2025, 12 Senate Democrats joined Republicans in supporting the Laken-Riley bill, the first bill to be signed during the second Trump administration. 46 Democrats in the House supported the bill. The bill mandates detention of migrants accused of a crime, including minor misdemeanors like shoplifting, even when there has been no conviction. The Laken-Riley bill is another critical element of the president's strategy for mass deportation. Now we're seeing Democrats up in arms over the lack of due process in the Abrego Garcia case, the Maryland man accused of being a gang member sent to a terrorist prison camp in El Salvador without due process. But this is what was voted for. A second story. Once in the second half of his presidency, when Joe Biden implemented the double asylum restrictions at the border, once that happened, we began to see the deaths of migrants in the El Paso area of the border skyrocket. They were dying just to the west of the city, going around the National Guard and Operation Lone Star in Texas. Border deaths have been increasing over the past decade along the entire U.S.-Mexico border, but Operation Lone Star and the Biden asylum ban accelerated the trend, especially in the deserts around our community. In El Paso, there were 71 deaths of immigrants in 2022. In 2023, the number was 148. And then in 2024, the number was 176. And this is just El Paso. And this is just the bodies that Border Patrol chooses to record and those it finds. There are many, many more that are uncounted and many more that are not found. On account of the increase of in the deaths, we began a humanitarian mission with people from parishes in the desert to provide water. Early in the morning, we would depart and leave bottles of water across known routes. Despite the prosecution by the federal government during the Trump administration in Arizona during its first term of those leaving water in the desert, we felt it was worth the risk. On one of those early morning water drops, I came across a young woman from Guatemala who appeared to be dying from heat exhaustion. The local fire department soon arrived and did something that completely took me by surprise. I didn't know what was happening. They put her in a black body bag. What I didn't know is that the fire department had developed a protocol to save those who were dying in the desert. They put them in a body bag, and then they put ice in the bag. Sometimes they survive, and sometimes they don't. Laura survived. In the actions of the fire department, I was witnessing the biblical story of the raising to life of the daughter of Jairus. Many of those who are found in the desert and are brought to the hospital don't make it. The temperatures have already done their damage, and no matter what the doctors do, organs begin to fail. It's a painful and an excruciating death. You begin to bleed everywhere, and there's nothing that can be done. These victims don't figure in the official count of Border Patrol because they've already been handed off to county hospital authorities. Thinking the worst, Laura gave me her identification card, thinking that perhaps I could help notify her parents. Thank God I didn't have to, but with her permission, I keep that card with me always now in my wallet. Laura came just looking for peace. I told these two stories as a means of beginning to answer the question, now what's to be done? And more importantly, how do we sustain our action with hope? Right now, our obligations towards those forced to migrate is just one issue among many in a highly politicized, polarized social environment in this country. In opposition demonstrations, marches, and rallies in recent weeks, many have used the Abrego Garcia case as a talking point against the current administration. I've been asked to speak at political rallies by elected leaders in support of the rights of immigrants, but I haven't yet. Something feels superficial and hypocritical. If there's something that unites the vicious demonization of the other, including those who migrate, on the right in our country's political discourse, and the fickle volatility on the political left, I think that perhaps it's this. I think it's perhaps a question of theodicy. Theodicy is the question of how to reconcile the goodness of God with the reality of human suffering. Theodicy is looking down at the path that Jacqueline took, hand in hand with her dad, knowing that she would be a victim of a structure of inhumanity. Theodicy is the experience of the mother of Jacqueline who will never find consolation or meaningful justification. Theodicy is hovering between life and death in a bath of ice in a black body bag. Theodicy is a family that calls our office, knowing the time and the hour that their loved one crossed the desert and in possession of that last text message, but not knowing anything more. What unites both sides on this issue is perhaps the denial of suffering. On the right, there's a denial that we are implicated in the forced migration of those abroad, that our economic and political choices have anything to do with their displacement, that our common humanity implicates us morally in their situation, that structural suffering in this country exists. This is a noxious religion, a faith entirely devoid of works. On the left, there's the idea that the peace that Jacqueline, her father, and Laura were looking for can be imposed on those who disagree, that just political structures can be imposed without meaningful human engagement, without love by fiat and order. It's an anesthetized engagement, ideological and not an engagement with suffering, at a sufficient distance from suffering, such that when it becomes politically inconvenient, the suffering of others can be sacrificed in the name of a higher political calculus. And the mirroring between left and right goes on and on, a Girardian imitative spiral downwards. Compassion distills in the crucible of theodicy and leads to solidarity, which is when we ask deeper questions, like what does the suffering others have to do with my life? How does it reshape my desires, my ideals, and my projects? These are the questions that shake our indifference coming from those who migrate to the southern border. This is why these people are attacked or silenced or removed. This is why Pope Francis believes migration is prophetic and eschatological, because migrants denounce the injustice in our world today by their prophetic act of taking action to move, and by their affirmation that tomorrow can be better than today. This is how the world is reweaved from below, a better and more durable peace. As I said, the loss of Pope Francis, which was just a week ago, it seems like so much time has passed since then, has affected me deeply. For one reason, because as I said, he was my boss. Shortly after he was elected to the papacy, he made the well-known trip to Lampedusa to celebrate a suffrage mass for the dead and dying migrants in the Mediterranean Sea. The language that he used in the homily during that mass, Cain, where is your brother, and the globalization of indifference, became leitmotifs of his papacy. And in 2017, he opened the Migrants and Refugees section, naming himself, with his characteristic disregard for conventional curial structures, the head of mission. I was privileged to work in the section for some years, helping to coordinate our work in this hemisphere. In 2016, the Pope visited El Paso, the El Paso-Ciudad Juarez border. This was at the conclusion of his apostolic visit to Mexico. He bookended that trip to Mexico with a visit to Mexico's southern border at the beginning of the trip, and a visit to the northern border at the end. Before the concluding Mass, however, which was just across the border from El Paso, the Holy Father had asked to be able to approach the Rio Grande River. I had the privilege of being able to organize the delegation on the U.S. bank of the river, there to greet him, and I still remember the day. On the U.S. side, the Holy Father's wishes were that we have a group of directly affected persons at the river. And so we organized a group of about 150 unaccompanied migrant children, as well as Mexican farm workers to be present. I remember there were an incredible amount of law enforcement officials on either side, Mexican soldiers, American Secret Service, and helicopters in the air. There was also a choir singing the words of the Requiem Aeternam in Latin. Eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. When the Holy Father approached the border, though, suddenly all the noise of the helicopters and soldiers and the choir seemed to stop. You could hear the air, and you could hear the birds, which flew across the border unimpeded. He didn't say anything. He just prayed in silence, an implicating silence, a silence more eloquent than any homily. In one of his last interviews before he died, the Holy Father was asked if he had any difficulties or doubts. He said no, only that he couldn't understand why God would permit children to suffer. This was a man who had tangled with theodicy, which gave him a real and credible compassion. So what needs to be done? The church's structures assisting migrants in this country have been attacked by the current administration, as well as her development work abroad. That's true. Many people have lost their jobs, hundreds if not more. The attack on civil society by this administration is gravely troubling. But, and this shouldn't be taken the wrong way, our institutional church has not yet begun to suffer. Institutional organized charity is important. It's critical, but bureaucracies cannot impose peace. Nothing can substitute for engagement, for compassion. This is a moment for the conversion of structures to meet the urgency of the needs of the 13 million undocumented persons in our country. This was what Pope Francis called the pastoral conversion of the church in Evangelii Gaudium. We have much work to do to go about the work of the pastoral conversion of church structures in this country to meeting the needs of affected populations. But the first step is tangling with theodicy, with the suffering of the directly affected, to feel their fear and anxiety and to make it our own. And we still have much work to do to integrate fully the magisterium and legacy of Pope Francis, that all things are connected, Laudato Si, and that all of us are connected, Fratelli Tutti. If our institutions have not provided a sufficiently prophetic response, it's because we haven't internalized these core intuitions. We haven't passed through the crucible of theodicy. What else are we called to? There's a lot to do right now to inform our people about their rights, to provide legal services to the extent possible, to organize for reform. The Bible gives us a clear vision of the struggle ahead. We're called to topple the powerful from their thrones, to hold the powerful accountable, to be refuge and Eucharist and food, healing and balm for all who require it, to share freedom and joy and bring the afflicted and the helpless into our homes and clothe the naked and not abandon, as the scripture says, our own flesh. In El Paso, those of us who work alongside those who migrate have a lema, an expression that we use. Tú eres mi otro yo. You are my other me, my other self. I don't want to control you. I don't want to manipulate you. I don't want to change you. And I don't want you to control or change or manipulate me. But I do know that now that we know one another, we're in a relationship. And I'm better off for it. And hopefully now you are too. There are those who lie to us that we need to fear the other, that compassion is weak. The truth, however, is that when we take the risk to reach out to the other in need and to allow that encounter to be transformative, to pass through the crucible of suffering, we're all better for it. I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.
so much. We have some time now for questions, and you're going to give the answers. We will, we're going to move a microphone to the middle so you can come up and ask your questions, and then we'll take them from Facebook Live as well. And we're going to limit the question to one per person, because there's limited time.
Thanks so much for being here. You referenced a couple of legal actions against service providers in Texas, and I've heard a little bit about some court cases filed at the national level related to DHS guidance that's changed about enforcement actions in congregations. And I'm just curious, is there legal action that you know of related to some of those cases that you mentioned about service providers?
Sure.
Kind of religious freedom-based legal challenges, as you kind of referenced.
Yeah, in Texas, the Attorney General, I began to speak a little bit about this, but maybe a little bit more background if you're not as familiar. The Attorney General in Texas has gone after a number of organizations that provide services to migrants and refugees at the U.S.-Mexico border. This is part of a broader political project, as I mentioned, Operation Lone Star, which has cost the state of Texas billions of taxpayers in Texas, billions and billions of dollars. No longer, Operation Lone Star is the deployment of the National Guard to the border, the construction of border wall by Texas authorities, and also a number of laws that have been passed criminalizing the act of migration. However, the state of Texas is no longer content to attack people who migrate and criminalize people who migrate. It's also now attempting to attack and criminalize those who help people who migrate. And so that's how it's important to understand that that's the context that these investigations by the Attorney General of organizations providing services to migrants, that's the context. Many of them are faith-based. Annunciation House in El Paso, Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande in South Texas, and there are others. The case against Annunciation House has gone to the Texas Supreme Court. It was heard earlier this year, and it was contested on a couple different grounds. One of those grounds is religious freedom. Texas has a law, the Texas Freedom of, there's the Restoration of Religious Freedom Act in Texas. That was one of the predicates that the attorneys for Annunciation House used before the Texas court, and we await their ruling. At the national level, I think you were referring to the challenge to the administration over the reversal of the sensitive locations policy. The sensitive locations policy is a long-standing policy, a bipartisan policy under Republicans and Democrats that protects schools, community centers, churches, people participating in marches, and hospitals. It restrains the Department of Homeland Security from taking enforcement actions that aren't necessary to national security or to respond to a direct threat. This is important to us in El Paso, because in El Paso, the sensitive location policy actually has its origins in El Paso. In the 90s, when the Clinton administration, when NAFTA was passed and the Clinton administration began to erect a steel barrier between Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, what the Border Patrol did was rush to the border wall. They began to sort of, the focus of enforcement of Border Patrol was to focus on the border wall. Before that, Border Patrol, it's hard to imagine, our imaginations have been so colonized that when we think of the border, we think of it as naturally being a site of enforcement, a here and a there, aquí and allá, not the permeable reality that it actually is. But at that time, we put up the steel border wall, and Border Patrol surged to the border wall, and that was the site of primary enforcement, immigration enforcement. Before that, Border Patrol, as I said, had been in the neighborhoods. Near the border wall in El Paso, right in downtown El Paso, There's a high school, which is in one of the poorest communities in the United States, one of the poorest zip codes in the United States. The majority of those at the high school were Mexican American immigrants or the children of immigrants. Now, because it was right near the border wall, and because Border Patrol were now right at the border wall, Border Patrol was present on the school campus. And Border Patrol would engage in direct pursuit of people on campus. They would be running across the football field, for example, where students were practicing for their sports. You can imagine the fear that this would have instilled into the community, into the student body, into the families of the students. And so the community led a lawsuit. There was a collective lawsuit against the federal government. And the community won. That lawsuit was adjudicated in the favor of the community. And the essential point was that Border Patrol could no longer use racial profiling as the primary element in identifying people who were undocumented. That was a huge victory. Later, under laws passed after 9/11, some of those victories would be erased. The victory was diminished to some extent because now Border Patrol is permitted to engage in racial profiling. However, the sensitive locations policy was an evolution of the principle that came out of that court struggle. And so DHS agreed to restrain those reactions in places where it wasn't necessary. Very early on in this administration, they reversed that policy. It's more intended for its psychological effect. It's meant to spread fear. Now that policy has been challenged. There are a number of religious organizations led, if I'm not mistaken, by the Quakers, who challenged in the courts the reversal of that policy, and it's proceeding through litigation. Interestingly, the Catholics were not part of that lawsuit, but it's proceeding, and there have been some advances and reversals, but it's in the midst of litigation.
Yes, thank you very much for a very beautiful presentation. Somewhere in the middle of your presentation, you made a very, very powerful critique on the politics, both on the right and the left. I thought it was very, very powerful, but I just want to make sure that I capture your sense of the dissatisfaction both with the politics of the left and the right in terms of really getting to this encounter of compassion that you're talking about. If you could just capture, for at least for me, again, I thought that was very, very powerful.
Yeah, thank you for the question and the opportunity to clarify. I think what I was trying to do was do an x-ray of my own roller coaster of emotion, experiencing those years of disappointment, disillusionment, and hope. In the United States, we don't have, everyone acknowledges, I think, that we have a broken immigration system. At the border, you see a significant symptom of that brokenness. On the one hand, as a country, we've been a wonderful country in our ability to integrate and welcome immigrants. We're a country of immigrants, obviously. And that's been the case since the beginning of our history. As I said, in El Paso, we've welcomed waves of historical immigration into our community. And this country has been able to harness the talents and the social and the economic and the religious contributions of so many people who have come to our country from different parts of the world. On the other hand, there's this counter impulse. We have a history of a politics of exclusion, of xenophobia, of racism, a racially inflected politics, of discrimination against immigrants. We go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That oscillation is reflected in our laws, and we haven't figured out what we want to do at the US-Mexico border. Because we haven't figured out what we want to do, sometimes the decision doesn't come from Washington, it comes down to the individual border enforcement agent deciding what will we do today, in this minute, of this hour, of this day, because we haven't reconciled these two impulses. We haven't reconciled them in our law. There's a conflict there. In the absence of coherent immigration policy, what administration after administration after administration has done, both Democrat and Republican, has been to resort to a simple strategy of deterrence. The only strategy at the border is deterrence. And it's deterrence via pain. And that deterrence strategy is like a dial. Sometimes we turn it up really high. The worst thing that we can do is kill you. When we put up the border wall, when we began to patrol urban corridors, we knew we were going to funnel people into the deserts. Death is part of the overhead of our politics of immigration enforcement. We can turn it down a little bit. The second worst thing that we can do is separate a child from her mom. That's, under the United Nations definition, torture. We can turn it down. Administrations turn the dial up, they turn it down. But the essential strategy remains the same. Deterrence via pain. We haven't figured out an alternative to that. And so we oscillate. Do we turn it up a lot, or do we get the ratio down in such a way that it's politically acceptable? We haven't figured out an alternative. That's where we are as a country. We oscillate politically, and I oscillate emotionally. We witness those oscillations every day at the border, administration to administration.
Well, I'm Cesar from Brazil. Congratulations for our lecture. I appreciate it very much. So, in the beginning of the Francis pontificate, we had the Lampedusa event. This was an important point, is this mark pontificate of Francis, and this show of the opinion of the church about these issues. Today, Lampedusa, we can say, has many names, and it is in many places, in Europe, in Africa, in North America, in South America, in our city, in our neighborhood, in our streets, near and close to us. So, what's the legacy of Pope Francis of these specific issues? And what is our responsibility as church, as theology, as humanity? It's possible to have hope. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Pope Francis, I think on the level of pastoral teaching, he summed up the church's response, which should also be the response of society, as welcome, protect, integrate, and promote. And I think those are the marching orders that he gave us. I'm not worried about the legacy of Pope Francis. In working, when I was privileged to work with the Vatican's Migrants and Refugees section and with the Dicastery for the Promotion of Integral Human Development, the most beautiful part of that experience was being present with the local church in the region, in the hemisphere, and to see that it wasn't something that was just coming from down from the top, but that it's embodied at the grassroots level by so many men and women religious, by local communities, and also now by volunteers, young people who are also taking up the cause. It's part of the DNA at the grassroots at this point, which I think is a cause for hope. It's part of pastoral praxis at the grassroots level. I think the other thing that Pope Francis taught us was that church leadership is only credible to the extent that leadership is involved in, Cornel West called it the funk, right? Being present in the funk. And he wasn't interested in clear and articulate formulations at the magisterial level. He did all that. But what he was more interested in showing is that church leadership isn't supposed to be notional. It's not just meant to be limited to the notional sphere. That there has to be a practical element. And he demonstrated that in his papacy. He demonstrated that with his body at the very end, right? He went to the prison at the very end. He liquidated his bank account to help prisoners. He gave himself in an embodied fashion. And leadership there's something. He went to the margins. He went to Ciudad Juarez. He went to Lampedusa. He washed the feet of people of other faiths and of migrants and refugees and detained children. That credible church leadership is about giving people an experience of God, not just talking about God or thinking about God, but an experience of God. And that's available to us, as he said, in touching the suffering flesh of Christ among us. I think that's what he gave us, and I think that's what's, for me, that's what's enduring.
Thank you for your guidance today. I want to ask a question that takes advantage of your expertise with a foot in the world of the church and a foot in the world of the community. For a few decades here, I've taught a course on Catholicism and race. And for the last several years, I begin my course. The first thing students read is an essay by a young man convinced that migrants from Mexico and fertility rates among Mexican Americans were crowding out native-born white people. That the native white people who with a natural right to the United States were being crowded out. This young man, of course, was named Patrick Crusius, who acted and took his responsibility for that act by going into a local Walmart in your city with an automatic weapon targeting Mexican and Mexican-American people. The last thing I have them read in the course, the only religious document of official nature, is the pastoral letter, Night Will Be No More, where Bishop Mark Seitz provides a reaction and a pushback in a pastoral but very powerful way to this idea that, in fact, there's a great replacement going on that provides defense and legitimation for horrific actions like this. I'm wondering, as you survey your community and you survey religious dynamics in Texas, to what extent do Crusius's ideas have purchase in the Catholic community, maybe more in the Anglo side of the community, and to what degree do Bishop Seitz' words hold more powerful sway? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Patrick Crusius was not from El Paso. He was from several hundred miles away. I would recommend, if you haven't, you can Google very easily. There was a moment in the court case last week. Of course, Patrick Crusius has already been tried in federal court. Now he's being tried in the Texas state courts. And the Bishop Seitz and I had an opportunity a couple months ago to meet with our new district attorney. We're in Texas, and in Texas, if you don't pursue the death penalty whenever you can to the fullest extent available to you, you're not going to be reelected, or you might be attacked by the governor. Bishop Seitz, at the meeting that we had with a number of church leaders, implored the Attorney General not to pursue the death penalty. And a few weeks ago, the district attorney, not the Attorney General, the district attorney announced that he would not pursue the death penalty. And he said that he was doing it because he had talked to a number of the victims, and the victims did not want to resolve the case in that way. A couple weeks, just last week, there was an amazing moment. I'm not sure it's unique to El Paso, but I know that it expresses who we are as a community, where a couple of the family members of those who had been killed by Patrick Crusius as the district attorney was explaining that he was not going to be pursuing the death penalty, asked permission of the judge to approach him, and they walked up to him and they gave him a hug. And they talked about their faith in Jesus. I don't know about other communities in Texas, but El Paso, that speaks to the degree that it speaks to our faith. It speaks to the culture of hospitality, that we're able to embrace someone who does not come from our community, who comes and kills us because of Christ. the racial divides are real. El Paso is a community that's 82% Mexican American. We're a little bit different from the rest of Texas, although demographics in Texas are changing. And there is a racial divide in the church. When you look at recent polling, for example, around the president's performance, there's a significant divide between people, white Catholics and Hispanic Catholics, regarding his performance. So we know that this racial divide exists, and we've got to do something to reconcile it. But I do think that having witnessed what happened in the courtroom, I do think that reconciliation is possible. But we do need to acknowledge that in the American church we suffer from that divide, and it can be. Patrick Crusius was persuaded. I'm sure he's mentally imbalanced, but as he said in the court, as his attorney said, he did believe the rhetoric that was coming from the White House at the time. And that rhetoric hasn't changed. And people do feel still to this day that they have a target on their back because of what happened and because of what the President of the United States is saying. And so it's incumbent upon us as a church to work to overcome the racial divide which does exist.
So, Dylan, you titled your talk Eschatology at the Border. And I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about why you called it that. Eschatology is a technical theological term that refers to the end times, right? So it can be, talking about hell and heaven and purgatory and that sort of thing, but it can also, and the end of times and things like that, but it's also takes in all of these questions about like the future, right? Things are rotten. Are they getting better, right? Do we have to wait until we die for things to get better? Are they going to get worse before they get better, right? What is God doing in this? Why are things so rotten? Where do we find some hope to keep going? All of those kind of questions. And I wonder if you could just talk about the theology of you and your organization, how you think about those matters, and about the spirituality that kind of keeps you going. What are your grounds for hope?
Yeah, thank you. The reason that I started by outlining the different, if you're familiar with Mexican food, the history of El Paso and the ways of immigration that we've had, it's like an enchilada. There's layer after layer after layer after layer. For those of you not familiar with Mexican food, maybe baklava is an apt comparison. And there are those who are afraid of that. There are those who are afraid of that. There are those who say that, who talk about, the theories of the great replacement, et cetera, that we need to be afraid of that. I think the beauty of what we've been able to see in El Paso, and it's not just El Paso, it's anybody who works with migrants, anybody who has the opportunity to work with forced displaced people who have lived through the reality of forced displacement, is that it gives you a vision of the reconciled humanity, of a humanity fully reconciled, of a new humanity, that we're on the march towards something, and that our acts of welcome, of protection, of integration, of promotion, that those are acts which are shot through with hope, because we believe that we're on the way to the new humanity. And when you work with people who migrate too, and not to dramatize or not to reduce or not to caricature their experience, but almost everybody that you work with all those who work in the area of immigration, I think, have experienced this, that people who migrate are people of tremendous, tremendous faith. It may not be explicit, it may not be Catholic, it may not be institutional, but there's a tremendous reservoir of faith there. Because you have to believe. If you've ever been to communities, for example, in Michoacán, or in these rural villages that are where the indigenous populations are being driven out. When we arrived by helicopter to the place where Jacqueline and her family were, there was the Palma Africana, the African palm, was literally encroaching upon her little village. The African palm, the people who were creating these mega crops and destroying the land and displacing these indigenous from their land. That's why they were coming to the United States, because people were planting African palm. And you could, as the helicopter landed, we could see and we could smell the smoke from the factory plant that was producing the African palm. And the African palm industry was actually paying. People talk about how, smugglers and how immigrants have to pay all these fees to come to the United States, and they have to pay smugglers and coyotes. They were actually paying the indigenous people in that community the exact amount that it took to pay a smuggler to come up to the U.S.-Mexico border. It was a gamed system. When you work with these people who are forced to move, with vulnerable people on the move, when you go back to communities where like Jacqueline's and you experience the life of the people who remain, those are people who don't have faith, because they don't believe that tomorrow, they don't believe that the act of migration is going to help them, that there's something worth aspiring to. They're communities of desolation and desperation. But people who migrate, on the other hand, they're the people with más chispa. They're the people who move because they actually believe that tomorrow is going to be better than today. And it's infectious. It's infectious. And it's deeply connected with I think, that eschatological vision of the new humanity. And I think that that's what Pope Francis taught us. The migrant, those who migrate, the person who migrates, she's a prophet because she denounces those systems which have forced her to migrate in her very act of migration. It's an act of denunciation, of prophetic denunciation. And it's an act of annunciation, announcing that, no, there's hope, that things can be different. And that, I think, is why the people at the border are targeted. They're targeted by those who want to silence that hope. Hopelessness is, right now, a national op. We're being lulled into hopelessness. The one who migrates is a prophet of hope, someone who denounces and announces. And I think that, again, anyone who's ever had the experience pastorally or as a volunteer or through advocacy or through the work that takes place here in Chicago, for example, to integrate those who've migrated, you're infected with that hope. And it's deeply connected to our faith in the kingdom of that future of justice and humanity and compassion and mercy and a fully reconciled humanity. That's what the kingdom of God is, a fully reconciled humanity. And so it's a deep gift to be involved in this work.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I would agree, we hear it all the time. Our clients have gone through so much, and they walk in with so much hope, and they inspire our staff at such a deep, profound level. You said a phrase that about our church, that there is a need for pastoral conversion of the church, of the bureaucracy, that we haven't heard enough. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? What does that look like? And just that struck me.
Sure. The church in the United States has done a remarkable amount to help people who migrate. Our institutions were built up as institutions to help the immigrant community. Our universities, our parish schools, our hospitals, many of our religious congregations were formed to provide support to immigrants and refugees. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, one of its signature programs has been assistance to refugees and processing of refugees. It's processed more refugees who have come into the United States than any other organization in the United States. We're in a moment, however, when that institutional response simply isn't enough. That there's got to be, we're victims, I think, of our own success in the sense that we've built up this remarkable network of institutions And yet the work takes place at a distance from ordinary people in the parishes. And public opinion in the parishes is divided. And so there's something that there's a mismatch there. There's a fundamental mismatch. Our people have not felt the pain. These are people who are in our schools, kids who are in our schools, kids who are in our parishes, people who are going to our social service agencies. There are people. And yet there's this divide in our church because there are some people who St. Paul talks about how, he talks about the body of Christ and that the suffering of one is the suffering of the other. If you go to Holy Communion, you participate in that logic. Well, that's not happening. It's not happening everywhere. Or it's not happening to the degree that it should. And it's because we haven't felt the pain and the anxiety and the suffering of the other right now. And we have to address that. And in this moment when our institutions are being attacked and our institutional response is no longer possible because it's not government financed, the mission still has to continue. And so I think that what we're being called to right now is a much more grassroots response, a much more community-oriented response that goes beyond just the necessary, but just the institutional. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question.
My name is Vian, and I'm the one who benefit from the USCCB, United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, immigration program. That's how I came to the country. And in my interaction with my Vietnamese brothers and sisters, I realized how strong they are supportive of the deportation movement. And this just baffled me. For them having gone through the experience, and now that they're strongly, that there's a lack of sympathy for immigrants in the country. My question is, now I have been in contact with your Bishop, Mark Sykes of El Paso. So has the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops provided any direction for leaders, church leaders, lay leaders regarding assistance to immigrants? How have they been very vocal in their stand against what the government is doing to undocumented immigrants in the country? Could you please just tell us if you know of any? So
yeah,
thank you. Yes.
Thank you. You mentioned the Bishop of El Paso. Not in Night Will Be No More, but in his pastoral letter on immigration, Sorrow and Mourning Flee Away. He says this, that one of the greatest heresies is to believe that God created a world without enough for everyone. Clearly, we need sensible immigration policy. We need to manage immigration and the flows of migrants. What has been so successful on the right is that they have portrayed, they have disseminated the idea that what we're seeing at the border is chaos. They have been extremely successful at this. It's a well thought out and calculated political campaign to persuade people that reality at the border is a crisis and that the reality in our communities because of the arrival of migrants is a crisis. To persuade us that we need to be afraid of the other because the other is a potential rapist or a killer or someone who's here to take your job. That communications media campaign has been extremely successful, and we can't underestimate the degree that it's colonized our imagination. And we need to counteract it with the truth, with the reality that we are implicated in migration flows of displaced persons, that we do have a responsibility to address migration. Guatemala, for example, it's one of the top 10 countries in the world most vulnerable to climate change. Guatemala is not going to address climate change on its own. Only with global solidarity will we address this. And we have to also recognize the historic contributions of migrants to our country, and the ongoing contributions of migrants to our country. When you think of the recent pandemic, for example, those who fulfilled essential jobs were disproportionately immigrants, both documented and undocumented, people who kept us fed and the people who kept us resilient, the people who kept us healthy, the people who kept food on our plates, the people who kept us resilient economically were migrants. They bore that burden disproportionately, and yet they weren't. There was no social solidarity with that population. We have to address those dynamics. The U.S. bishops, I think that there's at the level of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, at the level of Bishop Seitz, who chairs the Migration Committee, there's clear and prophetic leadership that we need immigration reform and that we need to stand on behalf of the vulnerable, and that mass deportation in no way is congruent with Catholic moral doctrine. I think there's been clarity around that. On the part of the broader episcopate in individual dioceses, I think that commitment has sometimes been more notional than put into practice, and I think that's the challenge now.
I think we have time for one last question.
Thank you very much, Dylan. Just thank you for the great work you do. I've had a first-hand experience of your very prophetic and courageous ministry. So great to hear words about hope being embodied in this in the experience of immigrants. There's something that really struck me in one of my classes recently. One of the students said, "Why should America help other countries?" And that strikes me as if some of the narratives from the current administration is or are being incarnated in the next generation. A lot of us worry that even if you think of the so-called anti-Pope Francis movement, that you're finding younger priests, they want to go back to Council of Trent, they want to go back to Christendom. And now we're finding young students being anti-immigration, whatever they call it, globalist. And just like Father spoke, I find many Africans being also anti-immigration here in the United States. So the challenge is really, how do you reclaim the Christian narrative, the gospel, of this non-transactional approach to accompanying the other, so that we're not creating this cycle of decay and allowing it to continue?
We have to pray for the conclave. No.
Indeed.
Thank you, Father Stan. Yeah, I don't have an answer. I wish I had an answer. I have nothing to say that's credible on that. I think the prophetic church is always going to be a church that's on the margins. I think that's one of its constituent characteristics. I think that's one of the. It's part and parcel of. It's the DNA of Christianity. I think, unfortunately, that we're always going to be in this tension between the here and now, And as Catholics in the United States, too often we reproduce the broader political tensions and dynamics in our society within our pews. And I think there has to be an examination of conscience around that. I won't say anything about the next generation of clergy. I think we all understand the challenges there. Yeah, and I don't have an answer, Father Stan. I'm sorry, I can't end with hope. I wanted to end dramatically with hope, but it's a real challenge, and I think pastorally, ecclesially, theologically, we're in a unique moment. But I do believe that Pope Francis has given us the tools and the witness to be agents of renewal in our church today.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to, it looks like our time is almost up here. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. Those were wonderful questions. And just a thank you to you, Dylan, for being here and answering these questions. A nice round of applause. I think I can speak for those of us that it was very moving, and thank you for your personal witness. Thank you for telling the stories and being a truth teller. We need that more now than ever, not what's being told to us, but really people there telling the story. So thank you for coming and sharing that with us.